And this is 2 ways out for a decaying Cuba, reinvention or collapse. We had planned to have Ileana Fuentes with us. She called me earlier that she had become ill. She feared that she had COVID, but apparently she took the first, the speedy PCR test, the speedy test, and came out negative, but still was feeling rather poorly and was not able to join us. So I'm going to be presenting Mr. Sebastian Arcos to discuss his paper and also discuss some of the policy proposals that have come out over the last couple of months related to US-Cuba policy and Cuba policy more broadly defined. The idea for this is my idea. I pressed Sebastian because I was very impressed with the piece that he had written, and I'd like it to be something that can be listened to by other policymakers, and that's why I thought it'd be a good idea to have this type of presentation. So without further ado, first I'll identify myself. My name is John Suarez, Executive Director, Center for a Free Cuba, and I'll be moderating. The main speaker will be Mr. Sebastian Arcos, Associate Director of Florida International University's Cuban Research Institute, and a member, while in Cuba, of the Cuban Committee for Human Rights, the first independent human rights group in Cuba. And Mr. Arcos has been interviewed by radio, TV, and printed media on Cuban politics and society. He's also spoken before the UN Human Rights Commission and has written a number of important pieces, articles on Cuba. So Sebastian, please begin.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me well? Good. You asked me to make a brief introduction of the article. It was published by 14 Medio about 2 weeks ago, and it's sort of an educated guess of what are the avenues the Cuban regime has for change coming up after the events on July 11. It is based mostly on 2 important academic works on transitions. The first one is by Sam Huntington. It's a book called The Third Wave, Transitions in the end of the 21st century, where Huntington analyzes a number of about 35 transitions that occur in those years, including transitions from totalitarian and authoritarian regime to democracy. The second, and the one that has more relevance to this piece, is a long paper by Mark R. Thompson. It's called Totalitarian and Post-Totalitarian Regimes in Transition and Non-Transitions from Communism. This is an academic paper. Thompson is a PhD from Yale in political science, and is the last of a long list of experts on specifically totalitarian transitions, what is known as post-totalitarian evolution research that began all the way with Brzezinski and includes very illustrious people in poli-sci and politics, like Havel, for example. It's a long, long field, and I chose this paper because it's the last one that I am aware of, and it includes all the necessary references to post-totalitarian transition. So based on these models, I looked at the events on the ground in Cuba, not just what happened on July 11, but also what was happening before, and made again, educated guesses about where can the Cuban government go now. The first assumption is that the Cuban government is either already in a phase, a new phase of post-totalitarian evolution that is called decomposing post-totalitarianism, that it has a very specific set of characteristics that I described in the piece. And the academic literature concludes that after a regime transitions into that particular stage, it has a limited set of options. And those are the options that I cover in the article. The first one, most obvious one, is a transition to democracy, a controlled transition to democracy. It's something that post-totalitarian literature classifies as mature post-totalitarian model, when the regime agrees that it's over and it begins a transition to democracy. In the case of Huntington, he calls that transformation, because it's a process that begins intentionally by the regime itself and is controlled by the regime most of the way to democracy. It ends in a true democracy at the end. The second one is the Chinese option. Everybody understands what that means. I look at what it requires and whether or not the Cuban regime has the necessary requirements to do that. Let me go back for a moment. At the end of the first one, transition to democracy, I always estimate the possibilities of a particular model happening based on what I see in Cuba today. I mean, the correlation of forces within the government, which is the most important factor in all these transitions. So I consider that a transition to a true democracy has very little chances of taking place, at least right now. I conclude that the Chinese model has very little chance of taking place right now. The right correlation of forces doesn't exist, at least I don't see it. The next model that I discuss, and this is the one that I dedicate more time, is a transformation initiated by the regime with the intention not of ending in a democratic transition, but with the intent of convincing the United States to engage in the way that Obama did, while they maintain an autocratic control of the economy and politics in the country. So it's equivalent to what dissidents call in Cuba fake change. It's more developed in the literature in both cases. In the case of Huntington, he calls that transformation. Again, it's controlled by the regime with the idea of not reaching a democratic transition. Think about what Mikhail Gorbachev was doing in the Soviet Union before the military coup in 1999. His intent was to reform the regime, not to transition into a democracy. There is a chance that that could happen. It is attractive for the regime because they can remain in power. And at the same time, they might be able, if the United States falls into the trap, as Obama did in 2014, they might be able to solve the main problem that they currently have, which is income sources. The last option that I consider is continuity. It's essentially what we have today. So the government insists on maintaining the same policies they have today: extreme repression, centralized economy, orthodox economic policies, and they might be able to sustain calm for a while, but I believe that the calm should not last, because what happened on July 11 changed the paradigm in many ways, and I hope they understand that, because the alternative to that is another popular explosion and a Tiananmen-like repression that could be terrible, not only for the Cuban population, but also for the oligarchy in power in Cuba, because that probably will not end the same way as it ended in China. Keep in mind that China had the luxury of killing people in Tiananmen because the rest of the country was engaged in significantly improving living standards at the time. This is not the case in Cuba. So it is difficult that an extreme repression will lead to the same results as in China. It will most probably lead to something similar to what happened in Romania. And this is predicted by the post-totalitarian literature, and I'm about to end here. It's fascinating to see how Thompson blends a concept that comes all the way from Max Weber, referring to extreme personalistic regimes. They call them sultanistic regimes. Mm-hmm. And Thompson argues that when you combine totalitarian and extreme sultanism, as is the case in Cuba, most often than not, you end up with a civil war. That's what could happen if they insist on maintaining the continuity alternative. That's it. That's the, I guess, a summary of what I wrote. And I am ready to answer any questions that you might have.
I just wanted to make an observation that since you ended on Romania, I think it's also interesting to point out that out of Eastern Europe, the country that the United States had the best relations with and pushed for most normal relations, actually there are two, Yugoslavia with Tito and then Romania with Ceausescu. And I remember Presidents Nixon and Carter doing that outreach, and those happen to be the two places where the post-communist period was the most violent and fraught and fell into civil war. So the question, so I guess my first question for you is, to what degree does the legitimization of these type of regimes by Western powers detract from a peaceful outcome, looking at those two, and also looking at what happened in China with Tiananmen Square, which you also mentioned?
Yes, that's a significant problem, because the legitimation, as you mentioned it, by Western nations, which involve not only diplomatic legitimacy, but also economic investment, only guarantees the continuation of a regime, but not any significant economic or political reforms. So by attempting to convince, and it's interesting because I just finished writing an article about the perils of engagement, Obama-style engagement, trying to convince a regime that the best thing they can do is to become capitalist and democracy. What you're doing essentially is extending the life of the regime. And we see it very clearly in China right now. I mean, even Antony Blinken has acknowledged that the consensus on China was wrong. And it has led to now a competing superpower instead of a democratic competitor in the international arena. So the basic danger is that you will guarantee the survival of the regime, but you cannot guarantee the implementation of reforms, either economic or political reforms. It will only extend the period of suffering of the Cuban people in this case, and the capacity of the regime to, by staying in power longer, benefiting from this and prolonging the status quo, that it doesn't work for anybody other than the regime. That is a danger to keep in mind about engagement. I was just looking at other cases of engagement in history, Ostpolitik in West Germany, the Sunshine Policy in South Korea, the Trump personal diplomacy with North Korea. It just doesn't work anywhere. And it causes exactly the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. So it's important to keep in mind that as nice as Obama made it look, it is not. It just doesn't work.
Well, and what's interesting is you also point out in your paper that part of the pitch that the Cuban intelligence services are due to the American military and elements in the US government is that by embracing the regime, they avoid, quote unquote, a failed state that would fall prey to drug traffickers and terrorists.
Yes.
Well, my question there is, President Biden back in July 2021 described Cuba under the current regime as a failed state. And the record also shows that the current dictatorship has collaborated with drug traffickers extensively, helped create the Solis cartel in Venezuela, trained and sponsored terrorists around the world, and in Cuba to export them to advance revolutionary causes. How is it that policymakers have fallen time and time again for this line of argument?
Well, Cuba is definitely not a case of failed state. It is a failed government in the sense that it fails to deliver what it's supposed to deliver to the population, but it is not a failed state in the traditional international relations sense. There is clearly a someone in control and in solid control of the borders, the policies, and the internal situation in the country. So it's not a failed state. I don't have any hard evidence that this idea that it is better to collaborate with the current Cuban regime to prevent a failed state was planted by the Cuban regime. But it has all the signs that it was. If you remember Ana Belén Montes and her role at the DIA, the idea that, or the assumption, because it's not an idea, it's already an assumption that is built into US-Cuba relations, that Cuba does not represent a military threat to the United States was planted by Ana Belén Montes. This is a fact. And it's a fact, of course, that she was an agent of the Cuban regime. So when you compare the two, they look very similar to each other. And it is not crazy, I believe, to assume that this could have been very well planted by the Cuban intelligence, because it fits exactly the narrative that the Cuban government promotes towards the United States, trying to influence US policy. You better deal with me because, and then you have a number of arguments, including the idea that if we collapse, no one can rule the country. Let me add, to conclude, that there is no case that I am aware of a totalitarian regime that has collapsed and become a failed state. Perhaps, and this is, I leave this to the assumption of the analysis of those who are listening, perhaps because being totalitarian itself reinforces in the authorities and the population the idea that there is one overwhelming authority in control of the country. It's very difficult to turn from one thing to the opposite. And even in countries where you had open civil war, like Romania and former Yugoslavia, you had clearly different centers of authority that were competing with each other, but not a failed state, not in the traditional international relations state, meaning of a failed state. Let's say Somalia, for example. It's not the case.
Fair enough. Now, also in your article, you mentioned about when the dam broke in Eastern Europe. When would you place that? What period? Are we talking Hungary 1956, Czechoslovakia 1968, Poland 1980, or was it later?
It was later. It was the so-called Gorbachev effect. And this is something that is heavily mentioned in the post-totalitarian literature. The literature makes reference to what they call precipitating events. Or you can call it inflection point or breaking point. There is an event that causes a totalitarian regime, which in its classic form is very stable. A precipitating event causes a change in the totalitarian regime. Let's use an example of the ones that you mentioned. The Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956 was a precipitating event. It caused a transition in Hungary from classic totalitarianism to frozen post-totalitarianism. And it lasted all the way actually it lasted for a few years, and it very quickly became what is known as goulash communism. In the case of Hungary, the technical name in post-totalitarian literature is hybrid post-totalitarian model, because it combines market and totalitarian characteristics. It's what we see in China today. Hybrid is what we see in China today, and what we saw in Hungary between, let's say, 1958 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1969. So the precipitating effect in Europe was the Gorbachev effect. When Gorbachev said publicly that the Soviet Union was not going to use military force to change or to influence policies in its satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe, that caused essentially the domino effect that we witnessed in Europe in 1989. That's the most important year for Europe, was 1989. Everything pretty much happened in 1989. You have countries like Hungary that was in a hybrid state, moving very quickly into a mature post-totalitarian, lifting restrictions, lifting border restrictions, and transitioning into elective government very quickly. Of course, you have Poland, who was going through its own internal transition for a long time. And Poland is a very unique case in many ways. Some of the authors argue that Poland was never a true totalitarian country. Or you have the cases of East Germany and Czechoslovakia, where a frozen post-totalitarian model had survived all the way to 1989 and essentially collapsed. It didn't go from frozen to mature, it just collapsed. And it collapsed because of the events of the Berlin Wall and, of course, the Gorbachev effect. I mean, things were moving very quickly in Poland and very quickly in Hungary, and then the Berlin Wall collapsed, and then it was a domino effect. It was beautiful to watch. I was in Cuba when this happened, and believe me, 1989 was a very good year for us in Cuba.
Now, you've been describing changes that were impacted by a top-down approach, in this case, Gorbachev and perestroika and glasnost and the non-invasion pledge. But my question is, you were touching on some of the errors of other administrations engaging with these regimes, but also in the 1980s. Actually, since we're talking about post-totalitarianism, I picked up this work, Václav Havel's The Power of the Powerless, and he goes a bit into the ideas of living in truth and of how that impacts a post-totalitarian regime. And I also look at the Reagan administration, his 1983 speech, where he engaged with the Soviet Union and the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, but in a very different way than the Obama administration, which was to recognize the Soviet Union as an evil empire, as the focus of evil in the modern world because of the type of system that it had, and having a very frank conversation on the nature of that regime. Do you think that had an impact in terms of the moral suasion and the building up of support or of morale among dissidents in Eastern Europe?
The other one blocks you from a lot of programs, and you can't open.
I don't know.
Nobody has the microphone open. We're getting background noise. Okay, I guess that's taking care of that. John, I've been referring to top-down most of the time, but not all of the time. The popular revolt in Hungary was an important bottom-up precipitating event, and the regimes in East Germany and Czechoslovakia did not collapse from the top down. They collapsed because the population went out into the streets. The same thing happened in Romania. Population went out into the streets, and that was a precipitating event that caused the civil war, as brief as it was, between the Securitate and the military forces in Romania. In Cuba, again, I have been working on this for months now, on applying this model to the events in Cuba, and I had predicted the death of Raúl Castro as the next precipitating event in Cuba when the events of July 11 took place. And since then, I am now considering the July 11 events as the precipitating event that pushed Cuba from a frozen post-totalitarian model where it had been since 2015 to possibly what I call what the literature called the decomposing post-totalitarian model, where I think Cuba is either already in or entering. So bottom up events could be the trigger for these changes too. When you refer to the Reagan policies towards the Soviet Union, the most important factor in those policies was the clear identification of the regime as the bad actor and the equally clear identification of the democratic opposition as the people to support the good actors that needed Western support. And this is a clear contrast with the Obama policy in Cuba in between 14 and 16, where he clearly said that the most important transition actors for him were the growing cuentapropista sector in Cuba and not the dissident movement in Cuba. This was clearly a mistake. Many of us, you and I, among many others, pointed this out at the time. I think it was one of the fundamental flaws of the policy was to shift emphasis from human rights and democracy to, let's build a middle class and everything else will come later, which was basically a repetition of our China policy of the last 40 years. And obviously ended in the same place.
Yeah, let me make a couple of comments, because I think we need to look a little closer. I mean, first, let me say I'm a demographer. I'm not a political scientist, so I don't claim any expertise. But what you're saying that Reagan did vis-a-vis the Eastern Bloc was done in Washington for 50 years against Cuba before Obama. It really was. That was clear. It was black and white. Number two, that was first thing. The other point that I really, I'd like to be illustrated. Let's look at Venezuela and Nicaragua. If we feel that what happened in Cuba with the disturbances there, it was nothing compared to what happened in Venezuela, which was extraordinary. Millions of people, dozens of people killed. I mean, obviously there are differences, but the fact remains, Venezuela remains there. There was the group, 50-some countries, putting all the pressure in the world. Nothing happened. And in a sense, the only thing that happened in Venezuela was no different than what happened in Cuba. In Cuba, 2 million people left out of 12 million. In Venezuela, so far, it's 5 million out of about 40. But it's been a massive exodus. And yet, now we're talking that Guaido is trying to talk to the other guys. I mean, I don't know the details, but, it seems that nothing has happened. And if you go a bit further, look at Nicaragua. The guys have been there in power now, Ortega for 20 years. They have killed, the disturbances a few years ago, several hundred people, the same thing people left. That's another point that I want to make. So I think, all I'm trying to say, how much do we learn from what happened in Europe and so forth? That's one thing. The other one that I think we ought to consider, and you may disagree with me, I agree with you that the position from Havana is trying to portray the way you do it. And there's one guy here who's a Levy, whatever his name is, who was Araski. Remember, Jorge, that he made a presentation and was making that same case, which is supposedly is a relative of Calleja.
Lopez Calleja, cousin.
Lopez Levy, who's the nephew, was making that same point in an ASCII meeting not too long ago. And the other thing that I say, to me, we're looking at what's happening right now, is that I don't believe that there's going to be a change in Cuba policy at all, at least until the midterms and probably beyond. For very simple reasons. After the debacle in Afghanistan, whether we agree with the withdrawal or not, the way it was done, what is happening in the border is another mess. And if you want to throw another gigantic issue that I think we ought to consider in all these things in a very different context, but not culturally, is Central America. If you look I follow closely because I work there, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, they are as close as failed states as you can think of in a very different way. But there are Latin American countries, and I wonder if there's some commonality there that we need to understand that it's not Central Europe. It's a different animal. I don't know, John, if you agree with that or too, Sebastian. But it seems to me that we've been badgering this, and remember, ASCII was created 30-some years ago. Mm-hmm. When we like you in Cuba felt that the end is near, let's prepare for the transition. It's been a heck of a long transition. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I mean, if that adds anything to it, but I keep keep looking at Cuba, and I say, well, but what? I mean, they haven't used the repression that Maduro used. They haven't used the repression that Ortega used, and they would be perfectly willing to use it. But the guy in Venezuela died. It was supposed to be the transformation. Then the bus driver took over, and things continue as they were before. So, I mean, I don't know. Just some questions in my mind.
Okay. Let me start by saying that I'm not predicting the immediate collapse of the Cuban government in
No,
any
I know.
way. In any way, these things take time. And the fact that Cubans went out into the streets on July 11 is only the first time that Cubans go out. And you are right when you notice the difference between people going out in Nicaragua and Venezuela. It was much bigger in those two countries. However, you have to keep in mind that those two countries, particularly Venezuela, enjoy a democratic system of government relatively recently, while Cuba has been under a full totalitarian system for 60 years. So a small group of people going out into the streets is much more significant in Cuba than a large group of people going out into the streets in Venezuela. At least that's the way I see it. But again, that does not mean that change will come immediately. The post-totalitarian literature doesn't assign a specific number of years to any given phase in the transition. Phases could last longer or shorter according to the particulars of any given country. For example, I mentioned the case of Hungary. Hungary had a frozen post-totalitarian period that was very, very short, because it was a question of the struggle between the new Hungarian leadership, the Communist Party leadership, after the Soviet invasion, in dealings convincing the Soviet leadership that their way was better than the Soviet way. And once they were able to convince the Soviets, then they moved quickly into the hybrid model. So the frozen post-totalitarian in Hungary was very short. However, Cuba was in early post-totalitarian instead of frozen. Cuba has been in an early post-totalitarian transition since 1991, for over 20 years, because each country has its own set of internal and external circumstances. You cannot compare Cuba to Poland, where, for example, to use the most obvious example here, where the communist ideology and nationalism had opposite signs in each country. In Poland, if you were anti-communist, you were anti-Soviet, you were a patriot. In Cuba, if you were anti-communist, you were pro-Yankee, you were a traitor. I don't know if you see the contradiction between the two. Therefore, the circumstances and the evolutions in each of these two countries will necessarily be different. Regarding Reagan, you are right that US policy attempted to do what Reagan did in Poland and in other countries in Cuba for many years. Again, there is no given fixed period of time when these things might or might not work. Sometimes it takes longer. And in the case of Cuba, unfortunately, they tend to take longer to develop. But I think the emphasis on the opposition, the democratic opposition as the good guys and the guys to assist is fundamental in moving this process forward. Keep in mind also that it was a lot easier, again, for the reasons that I just mentioned in the case of Poland, to materially assist the opposition in Poland and not in Cuba. When I was a dissident in Cuba and I left in 1992, the dollar was not legal, not yet. And receiving dollars from the United States was illegal and punishable by law. It is not the same circumstance as in Poland, where it was a lot easier to move material assistance to the opposition that facilitated the transition in Poland. Conditions in Cuba have been harsher than in most of these other countries. And the way Fidel Castro manipulated the nationalistic or the nationalist narrative against the United States has worked against change in Cuba in a significant way. So we have to keep this in mind. We have to be patient, wait for the changes to come. The good news is that the trigger has taken place and things are beginning to move. And my argument in the article that we're discussing is that the Cuban regime has no choice but to move, because they cannot continue on the current course forever. They have to move. Before 11J, they could essentially continue on the same path without any significant consequences. Now they know how the population feels. Now they cannot argue that they themselves believe their own narrative that, well, yes, we might have a few dissidents here and there, but the majority of the population is with us. It is not. That genie is out of the bottle. You cannot put it back.
Do we have a perspective on what is actually being discussed inside the Cuban government? It's got to, I accept the fact that they can see what is happening because it is impossible not to see it. So I understand that part of the argument. It's a little less clear to me that we have any perspective on what the dialogue is within the government and what they see as their options.
We don't know that. That is the big question mark here. We're waiting for factions to appear, not imaginary factions, but real factions, factions that we can see struggling against each other in public, not necessarily shooting at each other, but at least having open debates within the Communist Party in Cuba, where we can see and define a reformist faction versus a hardline faction. That is the last stage of this decomposing model developed by the post-totalitarian literature, because it begins to show the fraction within the regime. As of today, they still look unitary and unified and monolithic as of today. But we don't know for sure because it's a very opaque regime. It's very difficult to guess what's going on in there.
Professor Cazabon?
Where would the factions show themselves?
We don't know that. That's an internal development that is very difficult to predict. But once factions appear, we might be able to tell, depending on the strength of each faction, which is the most probable way that the government will go to. Right now, the hardline faction continues to dominate. Cuba didn't move into a Chinese model when Raul Castro took over in 2008, because Raul Castro himself is hardline. And it's very funny because part of the arguments from the engagement crowd here in the United States was that Raul was a reformist because he was doing reforms, and Fidel Castro was the hardliner. And Raul, pobrecito, had to fight against the hardline led by his own brother. That is the wrong way of looking at the relationship between Raul and Fidel. Raul has always been as hardliner. Actually, ideologically, he's more closer to the socialist communist ideology than Fidel. Fidel is more of an opportunist than Raul. Raul is more of an ideologue than Fidel. And Raul was never a true reformist. He was just making the necessary adjustments for the regime to survive. And he said it openly. So the hardline is still in control in Cuba. It was the reaction that we saw from Diaz-Canel in that infamous speech on TV, ordering people to go out into the streets. That's the hardline. The hardline is continuity. Somos continuidad. That is the hardline. That is what we can see right now. We cannot see any reformist faction within the Cuban regime just yet.
Yes, but the continuing deterioration of Cuban conditions in the economy and in the society in general indicates that, or suggests that, continuity is not feasible. Continuity has to be broken somewhere, because this is the situation, in fact, is not sustainable.
It is not sustainable.
So
and
then it presents us with a future of the extreme uncertainty that we just don't know. We don't even know about factions. We have to assume that there is, as I've been writing and talking about lately, is an internal dissidence. There have to be a lot of people within the government that are victims of the suppression of freedom of speech. They are the first victims, in fact, because they are afraid to talk their minds. But they observe the situation and they are unhappy, and maybe even some of these hidden dissidents are in the party. So somehow the system has to give somewhere. And that makes the situation extremely difficult to evaluate and to forecast.
that is correct.
We just don't know. We are in the middle of a big lottery or casino.
Yeah.
We just don't know what's going to happen. So the thing for me, at this point, the point is try to nudge the internal dissidents or the forces of change, which are hidden and we don't know, and they don't even know them. And then the real challenge for us outside Cuba is how to nudge the system towards additional manifestations of discontent, not just protests, just manifestations, expressions of unhappiness, discontent, as it was July 11th.
Not only that, Sanguinetti, allow me to interrupt you for a moment there. I think one of the things that US and European policy needs to keep in mind is how can we nudge the regime leadership into our preferred option out of this crisis. And it is clear that our preferred option is a true transition to democracy, a peaceful, organized transition to democracy. Some people call it from de la ley a la ley. Some people call it the Moncloa model, based on the Spanish transition model that was very civilized, very top-down control, but very quick, very clean process. That, I think, for everybody, I'm assuming, should be the ideal model. So we need to, I think, direct our efforts in trying to convince US policymakers and European policymakers into adopting the policies that will push, nudge, to use your word, the Cuban regime into that favored option and not the others. Because the temptations to remain or to go for the others, to go, for example, for the idea of a control authoritarian democracy like Putin, it's very, very big. So we need to be working to nudge them in the direction that we think they should be moving. And that involves statements like the one the European Parliament just made, but it is not sufficient. It is necessary to go beyond that into hard policy. And when I mention hard policy, I'm thinking about investment. I'm thinking about money. And perhaps, John, we can transition into the next.
That's exactly what I wanted to jump into. We had circulated along with your article 3 statements, one from the center from July 13th that was signed on to by a total of 7 human rights organizations, that was calling on the UN, the OAS, and the EU to demonstrate with action solidarity with the Cuban people. And specifically, in addition to recognizing the rights of Cubans to protest, asked for the active support of international human rights organizations for Cubans and the demand for the respect for the rights and freedoms of that people by the government of Cuba, and also for the opening of a humanitarian channel. Then on the 27th of July, the Christian Liberation Movement, whose members we had in the last session, Zoom session, they came out with 11 concrete actions to isolate the regime on July 27th of 2021. And this involved calling for Cuba to be investigated and condemned for its human rights violations by the UN Human Rights Council, lines of credit not to be granted by the regime. They were also calling for an international arms embargo to be placed on Cuba, banning Cuba from international sporting and cultural events, and also echoing where the center was, setting up channels to send humanitarian aid to the island that would be independent of the regime, and that would be a countermeasure to isolating the regime by demonstrating solidarity with the Cuban people. They also called for an international commission to support democracy in Cuba, that it should be created. And then, of course, we saw Cuba Decide just on September 13th come up with 5 measures critical of the US not being more aggressive after what was being discussed back in July on the issues of internet, on the issue of creating an international coalition of nations to support the Cuban people's call for freedom, and also about having an international forum to demand the unconditional release of all political prisoners, targeted sanctions. They indicated that was a good first step, but that needs to be expanded to target those at the high level and middle levels of the regime for their human rights repression and corruption. So, I mean, these are concrete proposals, and I think it'd be interesting to examine it and see how that would nudge along the international community in the right direction of supporting the Democrats while recognizing the Castro regime as the bad actors, and how that would also impact potentially with the players inside. So I leave that to you, Sebastian, and also to the others on this call.
I just want to say that I am definitely inclined towards more hard policy decisions than just statements. I think we've had enough statements already. It's important to turn these into hard policy decisions that causes pain in the Cuban government and open their eyes to what the alternatives are.
Can you specify the policy decisions?
There are many, and I could go into some, but we definitely, and I'm thinking of the European Union. You can say as Europeans that you don't like what the Cuban government is doing all the times that you want. If you don't do something about the money flowing from Europe to Cuba, you haven't achieved anything. The Europeans have been engaged, and this is the term that they use, in a permanent dialogue on human rights with the Cuban government for years now. And they have not achieved anything. It is obvious that the Cuban government is making fun of them, and they don't want to see it because they prefer the diplomatic way. But the diplomatic way, I think, is exhausted. It has been exhausted for a long time, and it's important for the European Union to side with the United States and begin using hard policies to push the Cuban government into the necessary reforms. And I don't see any other than using economic coercion. And at this point, in the evolution of the Cuban government, I think economic pressure might finally work, because there is no savior on the horizon. No one will come to save Cuba now. The Russians will not come, the Chinese will not come, the Venezuelans are obviously exhausted. And the other alternative that the Cuban government had was the Cuban American community in the United States. And I don't know if you watch the Cubans in the street after the July 11 demonstrations, the mood in the Cuban community is not for engagement. It's exactly the opposite.
But I think in terms of the hard policies, we're talking about ending the PDCA agreement between the EU and Cuba, which is currently, although it hasn't been ratified because Lithuania has stayed out, the Castro regime is receiving millions of euros out of that agreement. Another thing that could be immediately done would be for Western democracies, like the US already does, not provide lines of credit to the Castro regime. Another element, which would be quite important in a demonstration of solidarity with Cubans, would be an arms embargo on the dictatorship. Currently, Spain is selling weapons to the Cuban dictatorship. France is providing the cars of state security. Yes, ban it. And I think that's a very easy, relatively easy campaign, because how do you, when you have the president of the country calling on the security forces to fire on unarmed protesters, and you have the visual images of that end result, I think that that's a good argument to make. The last thing is we've heard in the conversation that there was only one person killed in the protest in July, and I think that that's probably not the case. There are probably many more that have been killed, but the state security apparatus has been very effective at terrorizing families and getting and silencing many of them. So we don't know the full impact.
I agree with that, but I think that, again, I don't want to be the skeptic in this thing, but I think of two things. First of all, whatever assistance Europe gives to Cuba is a drop in the bucket if you compare it to the tourism. So the first thing would be, and now they're projecting this year they're going to have 60,000 hotel rooms. Okay, so the other things that come to mind, I mean, I agree with everything you are proposing, but we're having my feet on the ground. There was a vote in the United Nations not too long ago. Two countries voted against the resolution: the United States and Israel. Nothing has changed, regardless of what the repression they may have done. Are we going to stop the remissions? I mean, and I agree, but if you think of tourism and remissions alone, they dwarf any potential foreign support that the Europeans might give. And I don't believe realistically that the Europeans are going to give up their investments in Cuba. So I'm trying to think. Another thing I want to throw there, Mexico. Look what happened with AMLO in Mexico. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was pathetic what the guy said, but a lot of people would go come with the same. So what I'm saying is, what else is there anything realistically that we can do to try to promote those changes that we all want? But I hear more of the same, but nothing has really happened. Except I agree with you that this demonstration made a difference. But how can we follow it up? I think the crux of the matter, and another thing that we need to mention that we haven't mentioned here, COVID has been a major factor. And the second factor, which we have been talking for years, was that they have shut, to some degree, the immigration valve. So, the people are not getting out, and I think that may be bringing a sense of desperation, because for many people, for many years, the alternative of getting the hell out of there was an option. we say, so is there anything we could manipulate?
Well, I think, wait a minute. I think that there are a lot of Cubans. There is a Cuban exodus underway, and it has increased dramatically during the Biden administration.
Right.
So, I
but
mean,
not to the same degree. I think, yeah. I mean, but all I'm saying is, so basically here we're competing. Are striving for political freedom versus human rights. So if you're concerned about human rights, right now there's a major crisis in Cuba induced by the economic situation, by COVID and so on. So is there room that we can manipulate the managing of the humanitarian assistance, the controlling of the remesas, which is a major support for the regime? That would seem to me to be a viable option to achieve both objectives, the humanitarian and the political.
Well, one of the things we've been doing is, when we talk about that humanitarian corridor, is precisely to take remittances out of the hands of the military, where the military is getting the bulk of those resources that's being denied to the Cuban people. So what we're indicating there is, we are in solidarity with the Cubans on the island, not the dictatorship. And the dictatorship has been the one that has been benefiting from the remittances. And I think that conversation, and Emilio Morales, who was involved in the group that I think, Sebastian, you had mentioned to me, was discussing remittances with the White House, has been driving home that what you have essentially is not a remittance program with Cuba, but the laundering of money for the Cuban military and excluding the Cuban people. On the second front, COVID-19, you mentioned about the spread of COVID affecting tourism. The paradox is that it is the Cuban regime that shut down Cubans being able to get food and medicine into the island through travel to nearby countries, while allowing travel from Russia, India, and other places that had very aggressive strains of COVID-19. And that was a factor that outraged the Cubans, because the regime is saying, no, we're shutting down travel to Panama, to Haiti, to the United States, Dominican Republic, because of COVID-19. But at the same time, they were keeping the travel coming in from Russia and India that was causing outbreaks in the island. So you had a situation where you're running out of food and medicine. The prices are going up because the dollars are still coming in, but you don't have people being able to travel to bring in goods. And the regime's centralized command and control of the economy, you still have the crops rotting in the field because the state agencies are not picking up the food. So I think that was part of that perfect storm that caused the explosion of July 11th. And I don't think that the conditions have changed because of the hardline element. And I want to ask Sebastian, one of the things I've noticed lately is Raul Castro sort of fell off of the map in April, but he reappeared again in July. And I just saw him in a formal meeting with the head of Vietnam instead of Diaz-Canel. What's going on there?
Well, the news of Raul Castro's retirement had been slightly exaggerated. This was always a maneuver, a makeup maneuver to confuse, to change the optics of the Cuban regime, but he is still in charge of what happens in Cuba. Notice how quickly he came out of retirement and into public view right next to Diaz-Canel after the July 11 events. Notice that he went to the airport to say goodbye to Diaz-Canel as he was leaving to Mexico. Even before, in April, during the Communist Party Congress, notice how two of his most trusted advisors, Lopez Miera, formerly the chief of staff in the military, and Luis Alberto Rodriguez Lopez Calleja, his former son-in-law, and the man who runs the, or who keeps the family fortune. Those two were promoted. I mean, they skyrocketed in the case of Luis Alberto, from a very infamous but not visible position as head of GAESA to the political bureau of the Communist Party, all of a sudden. And in the case of López Miera, from chief of staff to head of the armed forces, replacing a long trusted Castro follower. In the case of Polo, the General Leopoldo, what is his last name?
Frias.
Yes.
No, not Diaz.
Frias, no.
Polo is the name, everybody knows him. The name will come to me. They replaced the Minister of the FAR with López Miera 2 days before the Congress. And the reason Raúl Castro did this is to have 2 of his most trusted men watching Díaz-Canel, who is also, of course, one of his trusted men. That's the reason why he's there. It's just that there's an old Castro maxim that goes like, you must have everybody watching everybody else. And that's the way they rule. And that's the way Raúl Castro continues to rule. So in my opinion, Raúl Castro will be the leader, the actual leader of Cuba behind the scenes until the day he dies and is buried. And then we might be able to see the factions in the government. Maybe. Who knows? Maybe now. Maybe after July 11, we'll get a glimpse. Because these events tend to precipitate movement within the leadership of these ossified structures within the party. And as you know, when you shake something that is ossified, it tends to break apart. So all these developments are interesting and predict new things coming up that will in turn lead to other developments. It's very difficult to predict exactly what, but we know that these things are bound to happen kind of on the short term.
John, you're in Washington. What do you see happening with this administration?
Wow. Let me bring the crystal ball. Let me start by saying that I don't trust the Biden administration in doing the right thing. I think their instinct and ideological inclination is to go back to the Obama policy. If they haven't done so, is number one, because they are too busy doing other things, blowing up the Afghanistan withdrawal is one of them. And number two, because July 11 caught them flat-footed in the same way that it caught the Cuban government and us by surprise. And it essentially tied their hands. The administration had signaled before several times that they wanted to move back to the Obama policy. And what happened in Cuba on July 11 stopped that from taking place. What we have seen since then is paralysis. I was telling John that I had a telephone meeting with this commission that the president created to discuss and recommend or make recommendations regarding remittances. That was a month ago and nothing has happened. Again, they have bigger fish to fry. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, they just don't want to do what everybody is telling them they have to do. They don't want to. They don't want to get tough. They want to get soft. That's their instinctive inclination. So what I think this reluctance to move It's just a demonstration of how conflicted they are.
Yeah, but what do you mean? I want to understand. What do you mean by getting tough? What specifically do you see getting tough?
Getting tough means doing something that Trump didn't do, but it was part of the recipe of the Trump policy with Cuba. Continue squeezing the Cuban government sources of income here and there. There is a lot of work to be done in that sense. One of the things they can do that Trump didn't do, for example, was to look at the many holes the embargo has right here in Miami. And I know this for a fact because my wife's mother lives in Cuba, and my wife sends money and medicine to Cuba, and she has been jumping from one delivery venue to another delivery venue, and everyone is getting more complicated and more expensive. And these are people that are working, most of them, if not all, but most of them, that must necessarily be working through and with the Cuban government, because otherwise they will not be able to do what they do. And there's a large number of these little enterprises operating here. I think that became very obvious when the federal push to stop Medicaid fraud in South Florida, namely by Cuban Americans in South Florida, discovered a side business of turning those Medicare fraud money into, laundering that Medicare fraud money into remittances to Cuba. That was a large operation that involved a number of companies here and in Canada. And I'm sure they can take a harder look at that without having to go anywhere else farther away than Miami and Canada. And that would send the signal to the Cuban government that we are not fussing around with sanctions that are essentially symbolic and meaningless, because that's what they have done right now, up to now. Sanctioning López Miera is not going to change anything. López Miera doesn't have a bank in the United States. He doesn't travel to the United States to take his family to Disney. That is very symbolic. They need to be hurt in the pocket. And there are things this administration can do, because the Trump administration was doing it very slowly, perhaps because they were systematic about it. I don't know, I'm not sure. I think it was part of the disarray that characterized the Trump policy, but he was doing it. And they can continue moving in that same direction, trying to plug the holes in the embargo. There are many holes in the embargo. There are other things that they might be able to do. For example, they can resuscitate the Cuban medical parole that was suspended or canceled by Obama as he was going out in 2017. That will send a very strong signal to the Cuban government that they cannot just send doctors everywhere and get the money. They will risk desertion. My sister-in-law defected from one of those programs in Africa. I am very familiar with the process, and I am very familiar with the pain that it causes the Cuban regime every time a Cuban doctor defects. And I think it is not a crime for the United States to facilitate the defection of highly qualified medical doctors who really are looking for ways out of Cuba. And it serves the double purpose of sending a diplomatic signal of we're not playing games, and at the same time of affecting the pocket of the Cuban government. There are many other things they can do. I probably don't have the imagination to think of all of this, but there are many they can do. And they're just not moving. The Biden administration is as paralyzed as the Cuban regime is right now.
But at least we can say they're not moving in the wrong direction either. They've continued sanctioning some of the repressive aid, even if it is symbolic, it still drives the hard left crazy. They're also, right now, the State Department is doing its Jailed for What campaign, highlighting the cases of specific Cuban dissidents that have been jailed during the July 11th crackdown and highlighting their cases, which I think is indeed a positive thing. So I think we need to be critical in terms of its the slowness in taking action on the internet, for example, which they had announced back in July, and that's been very slow to move. And on the issue of remittances, which you yourself brought up.
They before July 11, they said, every time the question came up about Cuba, they said, we are carefully studying our options. And the answer after July 11 continues to be, we are carefully studying our options. I think we should take them at their word. And I watched last week the Secretary of State statements before Congress after the Afghanistan thing. And they continue to insist that for the US, the Biden foreign policy puts emphasis on human rights and democracy. We should take them at their word.
I think that's a good point to leave this conversation on. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions or comments they'd like to make. Well, thank you very much, Sebastian. This has been an illuminating conversation, and we'll be posting this.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you all to all the board members for their attendance and the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.